Greetings and welcome to Edgy Ideas, the podcast that explores what it means to live the good life and create the good society in our disruptive age. My name is Simon Western, and I will be talking to invited guests about diverse topics, exploring social conscious and unconscious dynamics and desires. Edgy Ideas is proudly sponsored by the Eco Leadership Institute. We offer coach and leadership training courses, and we have a vibrant community of practice where international members join once a month for a webinar. Our focus is on co-creating the good society. To find out more, go to www.ecoleadershipinstitute.org, and to read my polemic blogs and essays, go to Simon Western at Substack. Thank you for listening. Brad and Chantal, welcome to Edgy Ideas podcast. I'd firstly like to say it was really lovely meeting you a couple of weeks ago, and which led to this conversation. To introduce Chantal Meza. Chantal is a self-taught painter. Her home country is Mexico, and she now lives in my hometown, Bristol, in the United Kingdom. Chantal has exhibited in over 30 group and individual exhibitions globally, including galleries in Mexico, the UK, Paraguay, and Germany. She incorporates knowledge from local stone artisans into her paintings and focuses on human psyche through the prism of colour. Chantal has delivered lectures at institutions worldwide, including Harvard University, École Normale Supérieure, and Goldsmiths University. You're very welcome, Chantal. And to you, Brad. Brad Evans currently serves as Professor of Political Violence and Aesthetics at the University of Bath in the United Kingdom, where he's a co-founder and director of the Centre for the Study of Violence. Brad is a political philosopher, a critical theorist, and a writer who specialises on the problems of violence. Brad's the author of 20 books, and he's directed a forum with the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva. He makes appearances on TV, radio, podcasts for global audiences, and has written for the New York Times, BBC, CNN, and The Guardian. Brad and Chantal are the co-editors of their latest book, State of Disappearance, published by McGill University Press. You're very welcome to Edgy Ideas. How are you both today?
Yeah, we're really excited. Thank you, Simon. It's really, really nice introduction. And yep, I'm now in the UK, living in Bristol, and I love it. I really like Bristol.
Yeah, you made me homesick.
Yes.
So let's begin this podcast. Disappearance. Why disappearance? Why did that start? Let's start with you, Chantal.
Yeah. Well, I know that Brad likes, telling us this story about how it all began with me. So he always says, it was my fault that we are now in this mess called the state of disappearance, really. I don't know. I think, again, the beginnings for me are very interesting because you can never tell really when one thing began and one, even if it has an end, really. I think it partly was his influence, partly was my own life. So, as you mentioned, I born in Mexico, in a small village in Mexico. That's a land of artisans. My father is an artisan. My siblings still are working at the stone. So basically, they work with marble, they work with onyx. I think since I didn't have an education as such at the university, where I could study arts, all my influence really, as I learned to, later understand that my influence was mainly on the abstract shapes of the stone, mainly in onyx. So I think all those shapes I later started to somehow possibly even copying, since I didn't have really access to books or videos. And, it was a 1990s in a small town in Mexico. That's kind of like going to the 1960s or something. And, I don't know. So it's just a small town. You're very isolated in a way. So all those then shapes naturally, really, since a very young age, were abstract.
Mhm.
So I understood, and I had a relation with abstraction in a way in which I was, I don't know, it felt really, really natural. Although I obviously liked painting humans, animals, and things like that. So all that really was my beginning. So the human was still very much my subject. I had a bit of a crisis or so, like a few years after having a career, exhibitions, and so on, where I didn't know really what path to follow. And so I just basically take a bus and then travel to Chiapas, to the southern state of Mexico. And I went to visit some of the indigenous communities in there. Some of them were Zapatistas, others were various other communities. And in there, I encountered this problem because there were some families working with enforced disappearances. So people that basically are removed from the streets, the houses. And then that's where I basically encountered this subject, if you wished. By then, I think I started to wanting to have a sense of why, if art could be political, or if or when politics enters into art, really, if that's such exist. So that was a bit of the crisis, because I understood then that a painting was not going to do any help, which I wanted to. I suppose my crisis was in facing something like this. I wanted to do have some kind of change, do some helping, with the thing I was doing.
Yeah.
Now, I later understood that was not the path to follow, really. So then I started to have conversations with Brad, really, and maybe he can just take it from there. Yeah.
Thank you. Good, Brad.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and it was, as I say, I've been working on violence for, I guess, a long time, but I guess I hadn't been sensitized really to the problem of disappearance. And even though the more I think about it, the more my writings had always dealt with disappearance, but never kind of explicitly so. And I think part of the thing that concerned me once the project started to develop was really to think about, well, what do we mean by disappearance? Who disappears, what disappears, how long do they disappear for? But it was really, as I said, I was sensitized onto the project through Chantal's work. And I know like Chantal started to try to engage with a problem which was very acute and growing in Mexico. We know like since 2006, there's been some 100,000 recorded disappeared in Mexico. And it was a problem that was becoming more and more acute. And understanding, I guess, the realities and the responses that Chantal was doing to me was raising a number of questions. And I think to me, it really focused on a very clear kind of understanding of disappearance. And disappearance as a problem, which I saw as kind of short-circuiting everything we take for granted, right? So disappearance, when I understood it from the artistic perspective, it was basically saying, well, how do you represent the unrepresentable, right? So disappearance, the absence of bodies. In terms of, philosophy, how can you make sense of something which no longer exists? The idea of nothingness, right? How do you make sense of that? In terms of justice, where is justice in the absence of bodies? So it was through her art that I really understood, actually, the way in which disappearance always rubs up against the kind of limits of our understanding and the limits of our responses. And I saw that what she was doing was actually very novel and original, actually, in terms of how we might come at this, extremely monstrous problem in innovative and different ways. So, so that was the start point for us, really. Yeah,
I mean, it's just so interesting. When I met you in London, you were showing some of your abstract paintings, Chantal, and this word disappearance just really got inside of me. I noticed that I'd been using it a lot on the couch. I'm in the world of psychoanalysis, and I take my own therapy. And for many years, I've been using the word disappeared about my brother. I had a brother who died when I was 5 years old and he was 7, and he had leukemia. And he didn't just die; he disappeared because he was taken to hospital, and I never saw him again. And in those days, like you didn't go to the funeral because you were too young, and these kinds of things, So it was. I've used that language, and I think when I saw your abstract paintings and got in touch with this, it stirred something powerful in me, and and linked to so many other kind of forms of disappearance. We know that, the 100,000 in Mexico, the many people disappeared, the nameless people who disappear into the English Channel, in the boats. There's disappearing communities, there's disappearing biodiversity in ecology. There's so many strands to this, isn't there? Yeah, where is it taking you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important. You just pointed out something. It made me remember something I haven't actually probably mentioned before. That thing you mentioned about the fact that your brother died, passed away, and for you, in a way, it disappeared the moment you saw him going and never coming back. And I think that's something very interesting that happens the same with enforced disappearances or people disappearing, because ultimately for you the person disappears that was when the last time you saw them. So that's the last memory you have. So I think that probably even the wish for that presence to sometimes even to come back, or just to want to know where that presence is, I think was one of the first things that I encountered when I was dealing with this. That's why maybe I needed that. Many of the pieces, I think, especially those ones you saw in London, they're called obscure beasts. They are very much, to me, it seems like I always want to bring the body back, as if I want to know, to locate it. Where is it? And I think maybe that's why loads of my paintings have this mix of that you can actually see forms, you can actually see human faces, or even mixed the body mixes with the animal or nature, because it obviously relates to memory, right? How we remember things. We don't only remember faces or the ways our people are, but we remember them in places. We remember them, with their moods, with their highs and the lows. So I think the body is very much present there. It's always been in my pieces, but especially with Disappearance, it seemed to me that it was very important to see them. And I don't know I think those were some of the first questions we started with, especially with the apparitions, didn't we? Because we saw lots of bodies there somehow.
Yeah. And I think it, building off what Chantal was saying, and I guess connecting it back to your point, Simon, as well, is this question of apparitions and how do we remember these kind of ghosts of history, and I think it's intimately linked with what we might call the psychic life of violence, and the real kind of terror of disappearance is not just the people who are taken, but those who live with disappearance, right? So that kind of broader economy. But it's also interesting when you talk then about that kind of multiplicity of disappearance as well, because I can't think of any worse form of violence or crime than to forcibly abduct someone and never return them. Yeah. But the thing that we found when we were doing the exhibition, we set out, very much on the basis of, we have this problem called disappearance. We know that it kind of enforced disappearance largely gets its name through the process of what happens in Argentina and Latin America from the 1970s. But we know it's much more complicated than that. We can look about the history of enforced disappearance in Ireland, which goes much further back, or the transatlantic slave trade, but even then when we were doing the exhibition, the number of people who were coming into the galleries who were just, engaging with Chantal because somebody had disappeared from their life. And I think what it reveals is, however grand the systematic violence, it's deeply intimate. And I think there is something about that real intimacy of it that makes it so terrifying in so many ways as well.
Yeah. I think it is personal for everybody. For some people, it's a radical terror for sure. Like it's beyond imagination, to have someone has disappeared and either killed, or you don't know what's happened, or abducted. These situations, but it's so. I mean, I'm struck by I worked in a mental hospital asylum. And these people were disappeared from the communities in a different way. You got depressed in the 1950s and you never returned to the community. You went behind the walls of the asylum, where the mad people went. And it was, there's so many layers to this, isn't there?
Yeah, actually, that's something that I haven't explored yet, but I'm really interested in it because last year we were in Germany and we went to this museum and then there were loads of pictures actually of people, especially women, but also people who were drawing inside and then they ended up having an exhibition of these drawings. Very, very interesting, very, very powerful, very, very strong in terms of the amount of emotion, of course, but every pen or stroke they will put, it was so intense. Actually, I think it's very interesting, to see how many layers of once you start to think about disappearance and how people, either get isolated or get moved to some places to actually disappear from your view, but they're still living somewhere else. They still exist, and this is something that also we've been having conversations about. This idea of disappearance is actually just more of a movement. Actually, you're just appearing. Else, right? There is a movement that is happening. So the disappearance really is just about the actual movement of going somewhere else, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's that point, as you say, people like in Mexico, the people who are abducted from the streets, like the women who are abducted from the streets, are often taken to another part of Mexico and forced into prostitution. So there is that sense of that relocation, as you say, that violence of the movement, which I know, which you bring out in your art. But also, and I think this is one of the things we've also been trying to work through, Simon, is that maybe, it's wrong just to see disappearance and appearance as actually opposites. Sometimes they work together. We've thought about, like, for instance, there's such a thing as the spectacle of disappearance. We might think of like Hiroshima or 9/11, which were, disappearing acts in some ways, but you saw them, as monstrous events as well. So I think it's much more complicated than just simply appearance and disappearance. There's a lot of nuances within that.
Yeah, I mean, I was very taken by Freud's work on mourning and melancholia, which kind of addresses this in some parts. So he says that mourning is the working through the grieving of a lost loved object. You have an object you love and it dies, or you lose it in some way, and you go through this mourning process, this grieving, which he says then allows you to kind of move on and love again. You can love again. With melancholia, he says that you almost get stuck because you never fully acknowledge the loss. And that's either through a psychic state you can accept the loss, or maybe through a disappearance. That you can't go through the rituals of grieving and death because you don't know what's happened. You can't ever grieve. So I was taken by again your artwork. There's a lot of dark colors in it, and I got the sense of and I think melancholia is a very interesting emotion. I talk about we need to be in touch with our melancholia to be alive. It's not just like a huge negative. It's like, in some ways, we all live with some melancholia. We all live with some loss, which we haven't kind of fully mourned, fully grieved. And I don't know. I thought your art, Chantal, talked to that. This use of abstraction and color is powerful. I think there's something which speaks beyond words.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has to be. I think for abstraction to me to work, and I'm really this is something also that I know about it, but it's really good for me to listen to other people saying it, because I understand that from abstraction, it's not you have to understand, like you just said, the color and the shape. Really, it's just basically what you have. Now, of course, as a painter, you always think, or even as an artist in music, even you see in music, it might be this thing about silence, right? The silence are the dark spaces, not as a bad thing. Again, so the dark space, or the way painters, for example, we painters use the values, right? So the values, the dark side of the color is not bad. Actually, it's very much necessary, because it's not dark doesn't mean black or absence. Actually, on the contrary, you have a grade, a shade of that balance that you have to work with. So I think that is a space of interest as well, if you see it mentally, right?
Yeah.
So how humans do that kind of grade, if you want to see it that way, go from the dark side to the light. I think it's interesting to use it, to try to understand that abstraction as whatever emotion, let's say, it is complicated, of course, because melancholy could be many things, right? It can't be just possibly sadness, or it could also be anger. It can be part, sometimes even happiness. So you have all those things, and then you have to apply a shape and a color, a shape and a color for all those things happening, and then it just gets very complex. But it's so rich as well. So abstraction for me, it is so rich because you have to have that constant connection, color, shape, and then the human. You always have to be very aware of the things that you're remembering, not only purely sensational. I don't think so. I think because I don't even know myself as just pure sensation. I have to also be, thinking logical things. So I think it's all that mix that I find particularly interesting in abstraction. The dark color, sorry, I was going to mention the void.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we would, especially with Brad, and maybe he can explore a bit more than this, but one of the series is called The Void, which is just a series of charcoals and basically charcoals and graphite, and basically that's it. I think it's a space of precisely, Brad might be able to express this better, but a place of absence, but also of fullness. Mm-hmm. So it's full of absence. If that makes
sense.
So I think it's a very interesting concept we were working on in this series, The Void. I think is particularly special because of that reason. So
and I guess I think for me what interests me, and I'm struck by this. I think this point of the void is obviously people who suffer disappearance in their life feel this tremendous void, and as you say, how do you fill that void? And what do you allow to come back in? Do you allow that melancholia to be informative rather than kind of keeping it at the door? But I think the thing for me, I was struck by the point you made, something about this idea of beyond words and beyond language. And I think as somebody who kind of educates on violence, I think we need sometimes to recognize the limits of language. That sometimes we cannot put into words the horrors of the world, the magnitude of suffering, or we need to then give equal recognition to alternative languages or grammars, and to me, like, art has a really important place in this. To give you one example, when we did the exhibition, one of the things we were very conscious to do from the outset was make sure that that there was a kind of a description on the wall, but we didn't want it to be ideological. We weren't trying to say we are virtue signaling with this. This is just the problem, see the problem, relate to it, but we're not telling you how to think, feel, or respond to this, but come and speak to us through this process. And also, I took two cohorts of my students, and we had workshops in the gallery setting. They're by far the best workshops I've ever had with students, because there was something about being immersed by the art that allowed for a different kind of conversation.
Sure.
Different words become possible through that. So while we recognize the limits of words, it's also about how do we create the right atmospheres so you can deal with these intolerable violences in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I study Jacques Lacan, the psychoanalyst, and he talks about lack, and lack. He says that when we see lack, which could be disappearance or emptiness, that it points to the real, and the real is something which can't be symbolized. You can't use language; it's beyond language, beyond symbol. So it's interesting. He's taken a philosophical kind of perspective of that, and relates that to our unconscious, which can't be symbolized, and at times. So I'm wondering. I got loads of questions. I could stay here for hours. What when someone disappears, there's also often a feeling of guilt, a guilt for those left behind, a guilt for, like, was the person disappeared? Are they guilty? Like, are the perpetrators guilty? Do you explore that at all in your work?
Yeah, I did. I mean, that's one of the things you just don't know. Just guilt resides, what I was able to see, guilt just resides everywhere, really, not only within the person who just probably doesn't even, not only on the person who disappears, because obviously that's the most convenient way sometimes that the state works, to explain disappearances. Well, they probably did something. That's why they disappeared. Now, you can't just keep saying that, when you have 100,000 disappear, for example, in my country, right? So you might say, okay, I don't know, 5,000 of those or 100 of them, but not 100,000. So I think it's easy, maybe later on afterwards, to just dismiss that, really. Then the guilt, I think, even for families to, like you just said, move on. Yes, some families actually find it hard, of course, to just just move on, because some of them have, for example, all the children, or they have a husband, or the husband has the wife and the broader family. I think those are the places where that guilt stays, especially because precisely this thing about, would you let go? Even loads of people say, well, you have to move on at some point, after 10 years, or even after 5 years, after 20 years, you have to find a closure. Precisely this thing you were saying, right? Where do you actually close? Where do you accept that this person is no longer coming back? And even if you try to accept it and move on, then you still remain with the guilt, because you know and feel that you haven't done everything. So I think it is just it's something that it will just remain there. The things that you haven't done, or you haven't done enough for that, I think is something that's definitely been in most of the pieces. I think I've been in with that in mind, really, just that's something that it never goes. It always stays.
And actually, state. I was just thinking about how states actually mobilize that guilt. There's an analyst called Vamik Volkan, and he writes about our chosen traumas. And I don't know if you know his work, but he'll say that someone like they disappeared through the history of kind of Russia and the Soviet Union. So many disappeared, and that trauma will be evoked in order, like the guilt will be evoked so that people kind of are mobilized for a political cause. So it's linking to your kind of title, the state of disappearance is how states use disappearance, not just what they do to it, but how they kind of mobilize it politically.
Yeah, and that's why Brad also has mentioned this thing is one of the most horrible strategies, really, to do, because even like people that, let's say, society outside of it, you are being silenced, therefore you have been complicit as well.
Yeah.
There is that guilt, because you understand that you're actually being part of the same thing, right? So
No, I think you're right in terms of it takes a monstrous organizational effort to disappear a lot of people, right? So it doesn't happen easily. Actually, to disappear one body is quite difficult. So to disappear a lot, but I think there was two brilliant things which Chantal did with her work that really. Because I was listening to the stories she was saying and the responses when she was engaging with families and so on. And one of the series she did, the ones that you saw, in London, the Obscure Beasts one. I think one of the key points that Chantal deals in that work is to ask the question, who is the perpetrator and who is the victim in this? And I think that in itself is, this question of the real guilty people never get charged with anything, right? They're the ones who will always have the impunity and kind of removed from the violence. But like in the context of Mexico, we know there's young children involved in the disappearance of other young children, involved in narco cartels. Are they guilty, or are they victims as well? And I think that obscurity between who's a perpetrator and who is a victim is also very complicated. But also another series which Chantal did, which, really got me thinking in terms of how I was writing about this, was called Fragments of a Catastrophe. And how, the families especially will, the tiniest fragment becomes almost like a sacred object. To find a shoe or to find something becomes so meaningful to them because it is proof that they still were there. But even in that way, also as well, the way in which the kind of earth comes back into this, about, and Chantal's talked about this, about the way in which the ecology itself can also be a witness to these crimes. There's always something that remains. There's always, like, what Derrida would say, it's always there somewhere, right? And I think that gives, the letting go is because it's hard to let go because the violence is so extreme. But if you lose all hope, then you're probably totally crushed. And I
Yes,
think
yeah.
so maybe we should, in the letting go, maybe that is maybe the wrong move in itself, because, do you give up hope if you let go? And I'm not sure what that means for someone. So.
Yeah, no, people say letting go or moving on or closure. These words are difficult for me because there's something about an impossibility in that, and when I'm working with grieving families in therapy, I don't use these words. It's like it's like living with in a different way, perhaps, learning to live with in your own way, learning to kind of find a way to live, but. This idea that you kind of cleanly kind of move on to the next phase seems not in my experience. You both, one thing I'm interested in, Brad, you've worked with violence for many years, and Chantal, you're talking about disappearance. How do you live closely to violence and disappearance in your own lives? I mean, it's quite, as a therapist, I worked with a lot of abuse and stuff, and I had to kind of stand back from it after 10 years. It kind of became too much. Suicide, abuse. It was, for me, it was it became unbearable, and I couldn't offer the services I wanted to offer because I realized I'd reached my own limits. How do you kind of live in that space?
Do you want to answer first?
Well, I don't know. I think there's different coping strategies. I think, but it's interesting, and I've been writing about this a lot more recently. It was only after meeting Chantal that I was able to finally go back to the Welsh Valleys and write a book about there and the kind of structural and physical violence that happened during my childhood. It was actually, as a researcher, it's easy to go to Mexico and research violence there and engage with violence there and write about the violence. But actually, it's very difficult kind of dealing with it when it's close to home. I think it's very different for Chantal because she started with this project, which was based in Mexico and based in that raw reality. I do think you need to recognize that violence is exhausting. It's emotionally exhausting. But then I also think it should be that way as well. When I teach students, I say to them at the end of this course, you should be kind of exhausted by this emotionally, intellectually, because then you kind of know you're doing ethical justice to the subject.
Mm-hmm.
And then you need to know, okay, I need a break. I need to, to step back from this so you can go back at it again from a different angle or a different position. But I don't think we should step back from the recognition that violence is exhausting. Who can read the testimonies of Primo Levi and not feel exhausted by the end of it, right? So,
yes, yeah.
Yeah, I think so one of the things I do recognize, like Brad says also, you have to be, at least for me, like I said at the beginning, it's not something I was looking for. I was not looking for a subject. I rather was a bit lost in my own life in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So I was in that state, and then it just happened that this subject took my attention, and then I realized of the violence that was that this involved. And I think then I immersed myself into this subject. I in various ways, and that kind of brought me with it brought to my life lots of problems and loads of violence itself. So this is something that actually just surrounds you in a strange way. In Mexico, at least in my country, I was very aware that later on that it's just almost as if you are always walking in the path of violence, but you just don't see it, right? And because you don't see it and you are kind of not fully in, then you just can go through it without much trouble. But the moment that you're aware of it and then you try to just step in, then that violence, you realize, oh, it's actually next year, is next to my house, is next in my corner, is in my town, is actually where I'm walking to. So then you actually realize that that's just almost as part of the fabric of it. And then for me, a big change was when I came to the UK, and I realized, obviously, that the violence I grew up with there was not in here, so I couldn't see it here. I later on understood, and I'm learning now the ways in which the violence happens as well in the UK, but in different ways. Not as much as it happens in Mexico, of course, but it just happens differently and in different places, depends where you are. So in regards to disappearance, then after a few years, then I had to just move on, really. I have to stop knowing, reading, and getting involved in the subject, because it was, like you said, too much, especially because obviously I'm always been fearful of things happening to my own family, mainly. So because I know I'm here, so nothing can happen here to me. But it's that, I think that's the
but that was also part you talked about guilt. You felt guilty for being in the UK,
Yes,
right? Because it was so safe.
Yeah.
And I think that in itself was an interesting part of the extension of guilt, that you felt guilty for living in a safe environment, which in itself shows the broader economy of the terror, really.
And what about your guilt, Brad, for being a successful professor and you're from the valleys which are so deprived? How does that resonate at all?
Yeah, I think it's difficult. I think first of all, as a professor who deals with violence, I'm always mindful of not being parasitic to a problem, and I think actually, if I genuinely believed the peaceful relations weren't possible amongst people, I would never study violence, because to me, you're just a parasite to a problem if you don't believe you can resolve it. Now, in terms of the guilt of the valleys, I think it's strange. When you grow up in, so I grew up in a condition of quite acute poverty, and you understand the shame of feeling poor.
Yeah.
And that never leaves you, I don't think. However much you try to hide it, it never goes away. So you always feel like, I don't think it's just an imposter syndrome. I think it's more than that. I think it's much more, deeper than that. But you do always feel like you have to continuously kind of, prove yourself, And I think anybody who grows up in a poor environment always thinks the next day you're going to get sacked or whatever else. It's just a thing, right? So
Very familiar.
Yeah, and I think that, but I do think that we need to recognize the ways in which these social conditions, of whether we want to call them poverty and violence and deprivation and dereliction, they're just as much psychological conditions as they are lived material conditions. And I think to recognize that, I think the main thing is to recognize it. And I think once we recognize it, we can, as you say, you learn to live with it better. The worst thing I did was try to flee from that condition, thinking that you could leave it behind, where you never can, obviously. So because it always comes knocking on your door. So. Sure.
We're coming to an end of this podcast. It's been fascinating. Do you have any final words you want to say about Disappearance before I ask you an Edgy Ideas question at the end of our podcast?
One of the things I learned a huge lesson, which I was not expecting. Maybe that's why it feels so. I feel it's so important for me. Was the launch of the solo exhibition in October in Bristol. So through this whole process, I kind of knew, but maybe I didn't pay so much attention until this moment last year in October, where I lost hope in humans generally. There was like, just don't trust anybody really. And suddenly there was something in October that loads of people, the hundreds of people that I spoke with, that entered the exhibition, I felt like I trust people again. There was something that they give me with just the little things they said, or I just was able to see in them, that it just made me believe again. And I thought actually what I was lost, even sometimes I could say that point before the exhibition, even a bit the hope in art. I knew it was important, but not, I suppose I knew it's important for me, but I understood how important could be for humans, not only, painting, of course, but in general, art as art. And I think that was such a beautiful, magical lesson. I was taught by people. Yeah.
And I guess just briefly, part of our, this is an ongoing project for us, and we're also very much interested in disappearance in a technological age, and what does that mean, and how do we make sense of that. But I just reaffirm what Chantal was saying, that one of the big lessons for me, and in a time where the arts and humanities are facing such pressure and are in the crisis to the point of being starved of all kinds of funds and money, it reaffirmed to me the importance of art in terms of really thinking about the most difficult questions that we have. And I think we solely need, really desperately need rigorous deep conversations on all the problems the world's facing. And I think a lot more effort needs to go into the aesthetics of that as well, and the atmospheres of that, and how we create the necessary conditions so we can have a better conversation for what the world needs right now.
Yeah, well, that's very rich. And that's perhaps answered a little bit my two final questions. So I ask all guests, from your experience, what does it mean to live a good life and to create a good society? What does it mean to live a good life and to create a good society? Any associations or thoughts you want to share with the audience?
I think for me, it's just about caring, that care. You know, if you really genuinely care for human life, for the life that you have, and that you want that that happiness and that love and that harmony and whatever, something, you know, good things, you know, as long as you believe that those are important, and then you create whatever thing you're doing in this life from there. And then sometimes it's very, very hard, and, you know, things in life will happen, but you know, to remind ourselves, especially myself, I have to, through art, that I'm doing it because I believe in the human being. I think it's just that, you know, the love. I think it always comes to that, really, because if you don't do that, then, you know, there's no purpose, really.
Sure. Yeah, I think my lesson, I think it'd be two. First of all is, and increasingly seeing this, humility, and a humility to recognize that maybe you're not on the right side of history. You know, this idea that we're always on the right side of history. Everybody believes they're on the right side of history. But the ability to recognize that other people who also have different opinions who think they're on the right side of history. And I think to recognize that. But also, I guess, more of an ability to have a sustained reflection. And I think, you know, again, this is one thing I take from really great art is, in order for us to have sustained, rigorous, deep reflection, we need the time to do it. And I think in today's runaway world, with everything we want, imminent solutions and instant communication, instant messages, instant response, what the world really needs right now is to slow things down and to have, you know, a much more reflective conversation, even about ourselves and who we understand ourselves to be, in a way that can also be critical of ourselves. I think that's also important as well.
That's fabulous. Thank you both very, very much indeed. It's been a really rich conversation. So we'll finish the Edgy Ideas podcast here and we'll move on to our discussion.